What is a virtue and what is a vice? What does it mean to be good? These are questions we ask ourselves in relation to society, oneself, and perhaps one's God. But this long tradition of thinking about virtue and vice goes right back to the ancient Greeks, and now we're going to go and talk to somebody who can start us at the very beginning of the tradition. I'm joined by David Butterfield, who's a senior lecturer in classics at the University of Cambridge, and he's going to tell me a bit about Plato, Aristotle, and how the ancient Greeks configured or even invented the idea of virtue. Am I right in saying that the idea of virtue was invented, as it were, by Plato?
Not necessarily by Plato himself, but certainly by the ancient Greeks. Clearly, when we think of ancient Greece, various things come to mind. We think of democracy in 5th century Athens, but we also think of Greek myth, and we think of Homer. These are very different pictures for the issue of virtue and vice. So just chronologically, if we take a look at Homer, the origins of Western literature, we do find a concept there which we often translate virtue, this Greek word ἀρετή. But if you dig deeper as to what Homer in his heroic epics means by ἀρετή, it really means something more akin to excellence, someone doing the social thing they're meant to do very well. So it's not only a moral virtue, it's simply performing a task well. So for instance, a strong warrior has ἀρετή, an eloquent orator has ἀρετή, and a loyal wife in the domestic frame has ἀρετή in that regard. So that's not really virtue in the sense that virtue ethics and philosophy tries to explore these ideas. If we turn to Greek myth, we find all sorts of tales of things going well and badly, and all sorts of people being taken down by their inherent vices. But again, there's no coherent moral picture to that. It's not until the 5th century that Socrates in particular and his pupil Plato make moral philosophy a new way of approaching these questions.
You used the phrase virtue ethics. What do you understand by that?
By virtue ethics, I mean the philosophical subset of questions about how humans live well. Now, that begs a lot of questions as to what living well means, but it's fundamentally questions about action and about character in our human lives.
And what was Plato's innovation, if you like?
Well, in talking about Plato, we have to set him alongside Socrates. Socrates says something groundbreaking, which is that human happiness, which everyone seems to want, this concept of eudaimonia, is virtue. And equally, virtue is complete happiness. And for Socrates, simply knowing what virtue is brings you complete happiness. Why? Because for Socrates, you can't knowingly do bad. And if you know the full picture of what virtue looks like, you will necessarily do and be virtuous things. For Plato, he accepts that virtue is happiness, but he sees that the picture is much more complex than that.
Yes, is happiness, which is the ordinary translation of eudaimonia, does that capture the sense of what the Greek word is? Because I think a lot of us in the modern world would think of happiness as a sort of a rather interior idea of self-fulfillment. It doesn't seem to have a social dimension in quite the way that you describe.
You're exactly right. Happiness, a bit like virtue for ἀρετή, is one of these traditional translations that actually has moved away from the core sense. Eudaimonia is about human flourishing, about well-being, and it's something that can only be holistically calculated at the end of your life. You can't be eudaimon 1 minute and then something bad happens and you're kakodaimon. So in that regard, well-being is probably a better term. However, it remains personal. One doesn't become eudaimon because of what society is doing around you. It is internal, but it's much grander than mere happiness in the moment.
And what were the virtues that Plato set out that would help you to achieve eudaimon?
Yes. So there are 4 canonical virtues for Plato, and these remain throughout the Greek tradition in other schools of thought as well. There's the virtue of active wisdom, which is not just being wise, but actually knowing how to act. That's phronesis. There's the virtue of being able to control your own natural desires. That's temperance, or the Greek word sophrosyne. There's bravery, which also includes courage, fortitude, resilience, in the Greek term andreia. And then there's probably the most important of these, because it somehow stitches them together. There's the virtue of justice, dikaiosyne. And for Plato, it's a balancing act of the different parts of our soul, which he thought were 3 in number, and each of them had an attendant virtue with justice uniting them together.
The 3 parts of our soul, that's
3 parts of our soul. So this is an introduction.
Very proto-Christian
It's
idea,
very proto-Christian, a trinity of a sort. For Plato, there's the logistikon, the rational part up here. There's the thumoeides, which is the spirited and passionate part for good and bad. And then there's the epithumetikon, base bodily desires, roughly down here. And those 3 parts of the soul are to be controlled by reason, and the other 2 lesser parts, and he's explicit about that hierarchy, are to be kept in balance by reason.
Well, that's really interesting, because that's, seems to anticipate, Cartesianism and all the things that are to come later. Was Plato first to sort of really posit a sort of divide between mind and body, and to suggest that one was, if you like, more important than the other, or one had to be in charge, that your natural urges, virtue has to do with taking the givens of your natural urges and controlling them through reason?
Exactly. There's no question at all that Plato is a dualist. We have a physical mortal body which will come to an end, but our soul is immaterial and immortal. Our soul is our mind, and that is us. And so there's no problem for Plato in particular about the question of whether the real Sam involves this body. No, the body is simply what holds the real Sam, and the real Sam will survive. After I regret to inform you, your body will not.
Well, that's very dismaying to me. But obviously, the real Sam's body will have urges that the mind will not like.
Indeed.
And where did Plato see the urges of the body as coming from, if they were not?
They're urges that are animated by the presence of the soul within the body, but they are still part of that tripartite soul. So it's a bit of a fudge in one regard, and with Aristotle it gets even more complicated. But fundamentally, those desires, despite their being bodily, that they are the real Sam Leith as well.
Right. Well, that's good to know. When you talk about ӓρετή, and indeed about virtue in general, in the classical conception, or in Plato's conception at least to start with, are these qualities in here in a person's disposition, or are they, if you like, qualities that are attached to acts? I mean, would the notion, which is, a sort of Christian cliche, that you could love the sinner and hate the sin, make any sense at all to an ancient Greek?
To take that last part on its own, no. That is a later conceptualization of what is going on. But I'm afraid it gets quite complicated when we look at Plato in particular, because Plato, as well as his ethical theory and his physical theories, had his metaphysical theories. And most famously and notoriously, he believes in the separate existence of abstract, perfect concepts, possibly somewhere out in the world, but only accessible by us through our thought. So he believes in a separate category of the good, the beautiful, the just. And as such, to ask where true justice is could never be found in an action or indeed within us. All we can do is approximate in our activity towards that perfect form. Plato's successor Aristotle has a very different view. For him, virtue is an internal disposition. You have to shape through habituation your character into such a way that makes that virtue such that everything you do will be virtuous from it. So it's an internal state for Aristotle, whereas for Plato, you sort of look to the heavens and hope you can get towards that.
In what other ways did Aristotle modify Plato? Because one of the things that always fascinates me about the relationship between the two of them is that they seem to me, at least temperamentally, such different thinkers. Aristotle's so much more, practical and, he gets his hands dirty in the real world and he's interested in what's down here. And Plato's, kind of mathematician almost, he's a very abstract thinker.
Indeed so. And you'll know that's sort of the famous centerpiece of Raphael's School of Athens, with Aristotle pointing down for knowledge and Plato pointing up to the heavens. And that's really quite a good simplification of how they viewed the world. Aristotle is much more empirical. He believes the world around us makes sense on its own terms, and the more we can know of it, the more we can understand
I want to see Plato chopping open a sea urchin to see what...
Exactly. Plato did not get his hands dirty with biology of that kind. But nevertheless, both of them overlap significantly in regarding virtue as central to the good life. The nuance is that for Plato, virtue is happiness, but for Aristotle, happiness is the ultimate goal. Everything we do, if we asked ourselves why, would end up being in order to be happy. And virtues as well are simply a means towards that happiness. So they're relegated in the hierarchy of importance for Aristotle.
But this is a very, it's a very different concept in some ways to the idea of virtue that we have today, isn't it? Because looking always towards your own happiness, most post-Christian or Christian-influenced versions of virtue have the idea that often you put your own happiness backwards in order to do something that is good. The good is often to do with self-denial rather than self-fulfillment. Is there any element of the sort of ethics we think of now in these ancient ethics?
There is, but it sort of comes round through the back door. So the way of thinking would be that ethics is all well and good, but you won't have a life that allows you to live well ethically unless politically there's a stable system going on. So ethics and politics overlap for both Plato and Aristotle in very intense ways. Friendship, communality, being just to one another are essential virtues, even if the ultimate reason for that is that it gives you personal space in which to be happy. So a lot of the Christian ethics that you're gesturing towards are there in these thinkers. It's just the reasons why they're there differ depending on the thinker.
Quite drastically in some cases. Now, is it right to say that we think now of virtue and vice as being, like a horse and carriage, love and marriage, they go together. Did the Greeks have a concept of vice that developed in parallel with that of virtue, or was virtue something that kind of came first?
Virtue definitely came first. Virtue is the positive goal, and I've touched upon some of the degrees into which it's the same as happiness, whereas vice is a defect. Vice is not an act, it's not a sin, it's an internal state of something being wrong. For Plato, that would mean not being able to control your bad desires or the scale in which they manifest. For Aristotle, he has a much more famous and influential idea, which is the idea of the golden mean. The virtue stands at the middle of a vice of excess and of a vice of deficiency. So if you take a virtue such as bravery, there's an excessive vice to that, namely foolhardy recklessness. And there's a vice of deficiency, namely being a coward and doing nothing when you need to. And although it's actually too unwieldy to work, theoretically Aristotle believes that every virtue has twin vices on either side of it.
And is a version of that idea present in Plato, or is that Aristotle's great innovation?
That is an innovation of Aristotle, which endures for some time, but people realize that certain virtues you can't really conceptualize in that way. I mean, if humor is a virtue, for instance, what's the vice of excessive humor?
Very good question. I can think of certain comedians
who had the opposite vice.
Just too much, yeah. How influential was Aristotle? I mean, did Aristotle's idea of the golden mean, which is obviously, as you say, departure, quite a drastic one from Plato, did Aristotle essentially eclipse Plato with his ideas? Or did the two kind of, as it were, run in parallel in Hellenistic thinking? Exactly that. They ran in parallel. So, as you all know, Aristotle was a pupil in Plato's academy for 20 years. But then his ideas diverged so much that he set up a separate school, the Lyceum. And the Lyceum and the academy coexist as literally different schools of thought, which only become more complex when, a generation after Aristotle, other schools of Hellenistic philosophy emerge in Athens. And it's really a sort of buyer's market of which 4, 5, 6 different philosophical schools one wants to sign up to. Plato then has a better sort of early period over the next 500 years because Christianity and Platonism merge. But then Aristotle sweeps in the medieval period
when Christianity tries to make sense of Aristotelian physics, and we get scholasticism.
Yeah. How did the Stoics modify the Platonic virtues? Because you talked about the different schools of thought. Let's stroll through some of them, because I think that's obviously an important.
A great question.
aspect.
So the Stoics are emerging around the year 300 BC, so a generation after Aristotle, and they go back to the simple Socratic principle that the virtues are happiness. But they view the world completely differently from a Socrates or a Plato. For the Stoics, God is everywhere and immanent in everything. The whole universe is fated and determined. And all we can do if we want to live well is to live as much in accordance with the natural unrolling of divine fate and will. What does that mean? Well, the way that the Stoics square the circle is to say that the virtues we've mentioned actually in practice mean living in your naturally best state. And because the God that controls everything is equally benign, your living well will be compatible exactly with the good unfurlings of universal fate. So they double down on what the good virtues are, but they have a completely different reason for why they're good.
Well, that does seem, doesn't it, like a recipe for what later gets called antinomianism, or a sort of idea that, everything's the best of all possible worlds.
Yes.
So you can do what you like.
It's open to that critique, but in the case of Christianity, which believes much of that worldview,
well, Aquinas comes to that, doesn't it?
Aquinas comes to that, but there being a sort of benevolent demiurge or God figure who made it happen for good, even if we can't understand it ourselves, serves as some sort of constraint as to how you should behave. Well,
you've actually, you say demiurge, a God figure. We haven't talked much about the G word. God, or gods, as the Romans had it. How much did they have to say about virtue? I mean,
they being the gods?
They being the gods.
Yes.
In as much as we think, the holy books of the Abrahamic traditions, are full of do this, don't do this is good, this is bad. Was there any sense that the gods in the Greco-Roman pantheon had things to tell us about how we should behave? Or did they essentially just say, worship us and get on with it?
It's a great question. And there's no doubt at all that for the great majority of Greek and Roman history, the gods were depicted as completely different from the kind of rule-bound, you do this, mortals model you're gesturing towards.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Exactly. So if you look at Greek myth, if you look at the gods of epic in Greek or Roman literature, what you find is anthropomorphized gods living on their own terms without consequence and committing deeds which, on the mortal sphere, would be vicious rather than virtuous. And beyond saying, as a human, don't try to be a god and be impious, there are very few categorical rules coming out of the sort of mythic and literary tradition. So yes, there were religious practices, but the idea that there was a clear divine moral code simply isn't there. And Plato understood this. Plato knew that Homer was treated almost like a Bible in terms of its cultural presence in the Athenian world. But when he came to set up his own ideal state in the Republic, he was very clear that Homer would have to be banned. Why? Because the picture of divinity we get there is distorting, corrupting, and not at all helpful to live the really divine life of approximating towards what these transcendent virtues look like.
Yeah, he's a philosopher king. I mean, I'm intrigued by this question of the way the gods behaved being what we would see in the sublunary world as probably evil. The same is true, isn't it, of the heroes of myth? I remember talking some years ago to Madeleine Miller about, Theseus. And she was like, the guy was a, serial rapist. He was, actually what we think of as a really, really, really bad person. Would there have been any sense for the Greeks and Romans that this was problematic? That's
not problematic. If you mean, isn't it awkward that our myths are morally suspect? As it is, the myths, again, who have a completely organic origin. No one sat down and created this collection of stories. They tend to be explorations of always elite or larger-than-life figures mixing good and bad in their interactions with divinity. That's the sort of general summary. And it's very hard to draw together the threads of a moral code from them beyond not upsetting divinity through your own hubris, your own pride. But the idea that, if you do bad things, bad will come to you, it simply isn't there. And if you do good things, you'll have a good life isn't there either. So they'd be less worried about how the myths are because they don't believe the myths are trying to convey a sort of shared moral message in the way that a religious fable might.
Yeah. I know the historian Tom Holland has always said that the great radical divide in history is when Christianity arrives and the idea that weakness or meekness or vulnerability can itself be a virtue. Do you subscribe to that view? I mean, the idea that, strength was worshipped in Greco-Roman ethics in a way that it isn't in Christian ethics.
Yeah, I do agree with that. There are various, I would say, New Testament virtues which come into play through the Christian tradition, which simply either aren't there as virtues beforehand or the concepts aren't even understood. So humility and meekness and mercy are all among that. If you searched online, what is the ancient Greek for mercy, you will find a word. But once you look more closely, you see that it's very particularly about power relations between a dominant male and an inferior male. And the dominant male might, through mercy, not do what is normally done. So it's a very circumscribed notion of mercy. And humility, in the sense Christians would understand it, it isn't there. And that creates the space for a completely different development and evolution of morality, from it being an elite thing that the intellectuals attempt to practice, to being something that every human born into sin in the Christian thinking is equally free to partake in.
So is there, we talk about mercy, is there a Greco-Roman concept of forgiveness? The idea that sin or virtue are, as it were, relational, and that, that they are negotiated between the sinner and the sinned against?
No. So again, you will find a word that's often translated as forgiveness. It's more pardoning or tactical forgetting of a misdeed. There's no sense at all that one's sins, to use a Christian term again, can be redeemed, somehow cancelled out. The best you can do is to aim to do better, and hopefully people will forget about the evil that was done. So again, forgiveness is a very good example of a Christian introduction.
Now, we talked briefly about how the Stoics modified the Platonic virtues. Could I ask about one of your specialisms, the Epicureans? How did they change the way?
Yes, well, they are the radical group among those we're talking about. Epicureans, founded by Epicurus, roughly at the same time that the Stoics came about, around 300 BC. They reject the idea that the virtues are at the top of the pyramid. And they say, yes, it's still happiness at the top of the pyramid, but perfect happiness is about pleasure. So they introduced the category of pleasure, which had always been on the sidelines with those other thinkers. And they regard a state of tranquil absence of pain, a sort of Zen state, as the ultimate goal in life. And that has consequences because it doesn't just mean virtues are a means to achieving that. Some virtues are an obstruction. If justice is a good thing, and you spend all of your time worrying about the injustice around you and running around trying to solve these problems, you won't reach the happiness that Epicureans seek. So it's obstructive to be too just in the Epicurean system.
Does that produce a kind of, I won't say anything as crude as selfishness, but does it essentially relocate the site of virtue in the self in a way that I guess, as you describe it, Plato and Aristotle would have seen as more relational?
It does. Epicurus tries to sort of have his cake and eat it in that regard. He realizes that this state of tranquility is internal and as such private. And he preaches, if that's not too strong a word, that politics is the last thing you want to get involved with. And in Athens, that was a very controversial thing. Part of being a citizen was to be active politically. And our word idiot actually comes from an idiotes, which is a Greek who doesn't get involved. Idiotic. For Epicurus, you retreat into your own community. But he's clear that it needs to be a community and not living as a hermit. Because friendship allows you to have the philosophical conversations, which are what you do when you've reached the perfect state. You're not meditating alone, you're conversing about philosophical truths. That's as good as it gets for Epicurus.
Now, you say in your abstracts of your talk that you essentially say the Romans haven't got anything to add. You know, this whole long civilization that follows the Greeks, and they don't add it. Can that be right? Why do you say that?
It's a provocative way of putting it, but it's almost true that before Christianity comes into play, the net contribution of the Romans to the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition is tiny. Why? Well, one reason is that it's not until relatively late in Roman history, namely the 2nd century BC, so after 500 years of Rome, that Greek thinking is engaged with seriously by the Romans. And they weren't doing Roman thinking, they were simply living by their own cultural codes. They had morality.
They weren't doing anything at all.
They weren't doing so much thinking.
The Greeks, they were just wandering around with sort of empty heads.
But they had a very simple culture, which was the way things have been done is the good way, and let's stick to them. That's sort of a caricature, but that was the general picture. So it's only late in the day, in the 2nd and 1st century BC, that these Greek philosophical ideas come into play. And different figures are moved in different ways by them. Cicero becomes an academic in the Platonic tradition. Julius Caesar is drawn to the Epicureans. And once the emperors come into play, Stoicism finds a new lease of life. Seneca advised to
we see an awful lot of students wandering around with copies of Marcus Aurelius.
We do. Marcus Aurelius is playing big at the moment.
Mary Beard says he's useless. I don't know whether you share her view.
No, I don't share that view at all. It depends what she means, of course. He's very useful to philosophers because he's one of our main sources for Stoicism. I think his importance is artificially enlarged for that reason. The Greeks who founded Stoicism, Zeno, Chrysippus, all of these guys, their works are lost. So Seneca and Marcus Aurelius are very good data points to understand the original thoughts. But yes, there's a popular image of the emperor doing his own stoic bro stuff on his own that has really caught on in recent years for whatever reason.
David Butterfield, thank you very much indeed.
A pleasure. Thank you.